The proceeds from these 4 webinars support the WAMO Scholarship Fund. I want to take a moment and say thank you to all of those who have already made contributions while registering for today's webinar. A little about the Scholarship Fund. If you are a WAMO member, you've seen the 2024 awardees featured in the winter issue of the Ohio Water Table, WAMO's quarterly newsletter. This is Kaylee, who was a recipient of the undergraduate scholarship for last year. And then we have Kalia, who was our graduate student scholarship recipient in the 2024 giving cycle. WAMO is currently putting together its team of reviewers as it picks its 2025 awardees. And if you have more questions about the scholarship fund or would like to support, please visit the website featured on the slide. And you may also contact Sarah Saylor, who is our representative from WAMO. So again, today's webinar is hosted by the OSWA, our education committee. The OSWA is a nonprofit, non-political organization that is dedicated to advancing the management of stormwater and related natural resources through education, leadership, watershed-based coordination, and technical assistance within Ohio. We are a division of WAMO, as shown on the previous slide. We are governed by a board of directors. Regina Collins with the City of Toledo is our current president. We have board members and emeritus board members as well. We are also comprised of several committees: our conference committee, education, marketing and membership, regulatory, transportation, industrial, and extreme weather committees. If you are interested in joining the Ohio Stormwater Association, as stated before, we are a division of WAMO, so you would need to register through the WAMO's website and then select Stormwater as your division. And there are benefits to being a member of OSWA. You will receive access to today's webinar and all prior webinars sponsored by us. We do have discounts and trainings on trainings from OSWA and our affiliates. And also our affiliates, US River Maps, has discounts as well. Today's webinar that does have opportunities for CUs and PDHs. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance and you have not done so already, you will need to register for the webinar so that we know who to send their certificate to. And there is a $15 fee to obtain certification. As stated before, this webinar is, the proceeds will be shared with WAMO for the scholarship fund. So today's agenda, we have Dan from Ohio EPA Division of Surface Water. He has been with Ohio EPA for 32 years, working in the stormwater program almost from its inception. During his tenure, he has developed permit language and a number of policy and guidance documents for the Ohio EPA stormwater program. Dan holds a BS degree in chemical engineering from Case Western Reserve University and a MS in chemical engineering from the Ohio State University and a MBA from Case Western University's Weatherhead School of Management. In 2008, he received the Wayne S. Nichols Award from the Water Management Association of Ohio for his demonstrated leadership in the NPDES Stormwater Permit Program. And in 2014, he received the LT Haggerty Award from the Ohio Water Environmental Association for his work on the Northeast Ohio Stormwater Training Council. In 2024, he won the Legacy Conservationist Award from the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. And in 2025, he was the proud recipient of the Ohio Stormwater Association's Award for Individual Excellence. He is also a certified erosion sediment and stormwater inspector and certified professional in municipal stormwater management. Currently, Dan serves in the capacity of a supervisor in the Division of Surface Water at the Ohio EPA's Northeast Regional Office, where he supervises inspectors in the Northeast, Northwest, and Southeast regional offices who are responsible for ensuring compliance with NPDES stormwater regulations in those regions.
Great.
I will
Thank you,
stop
Lashana.
sharing my screen.
All right,
All
let
right.
me get mine shared and we can get going. Thank you, Lashana, for inviting me today to speak to the group. And let me know if I shared my screen properly or not. I don't think I did. How do I do that?
Hey, I am seeing your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, oh, you are seeing the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, but
Because,
not in presenter view. It's just
all right,
your.
well, okay, now I'm seeing it in presenter view, but I don't have the share button to, can you see it now or no?
No, I cannot.
All right, let's try to do that again. Sorry for being technically challenged. You know, I'm getting to that age where technology is getting beyond me, right? So hit the green
We
share
will
button,
figure it out together. Yes, so hit the green share button.
then the blue share button. And now you see the presentation, but
Click from the beginning.
From beginning.
yep. There we go. All right. So we're
We're
all
all
set
good.
now? All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad you guys stuck with me through that to get that presentation going. So hopefully you'll find this informative and enjoyable as you go through it. So I was asked today to give you an overview of Ohio EPA's industrial stormwater program. So that's what I'm going to do. But of course, first we like kind of lay out, you know, why is it that we regulate runoff from an industrial site? Well, think about what happens, right? I mean, we store materials, we process materials, we handle materials, and things can spill. And if we're not careful, if how we do those things, you know, when it rains, that's all on the ground, and the rain washes it off into the stormwater drainage system. So whether that, you know, be the materials that you use or the activities that you conduct, industrial sites create pollution, and when it rains, it washes off the facility. So the stormwater program really has three distinct parts and pieces to it. The industrial permit and program is just one of those three pieces. Those other two pieces are the construction program and our municipal stormwater program, but we won't really talk about those today. The stormwater permit program is really a part and piece of the NPDES permit program, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program, that was established under the Federal Clean Water Act back in 1972. Originally, though, that those permits were really just issued to wastewater discharges, and it really wasn't until 1992 that they were applied to stormwater runoff. Within Ohio, it's codified within Ohio Revised Code 6111 that you, in order to discharge pollutants in runoff from your site, if you're one of those regulated activities, you have to have an NPDES permit and comply with it. So you will need a permit if you discharge your runoff to waters of the state or to a municipal separate storm sewer system, or MS4, which is basically a publicly owned conveyance system for stormwater. But if you discharge your runoff to sanitary sewers or to a combined sewer system upstream of an overflow regulator, you really wouldn't be required to obtain an industrial stormwater permit. And we have our first poll question. When did Ohio EPA first begin issuing stormwater general permits? I'm assuming, Sarah, you're going to end the poll? Or is that something that I do? There you go. All right. So it looks like the most popular answer is the correct answer, right? So 41% of you got that right. It was 1992 that Ohio EPA first issued a general permit for one of those three categories of stormwater runoff. Very good. All right, how do we move on from that question then? Shit. Nope, no, I don't have control of the screen. Everybody see the results? All right. Okay, there we go, I think. All right, we got it. All right, so who needs an industrial stormwater permit? What types of permits are out there for you to obtain the coverage that you might need? That's what we'll cover over the next section. So the definition of stormwater associated with industrial activity can be found within Ohio Administrative Code 3745-39-04B13. That's where it lays out the types of facilities that would be potentially subject to needing a permit. There's 11 different categories. They're pretty broad, but if you really want to break it down in the most easy way to understand, basically, if you manufacture anything, you are likely to be pulled into the program. We also do include some other categories that don't necessarily manufacture stuff, like maybe a recycling facility or a municipal solid waste landfill, but those are also included within that definition. So if you fall within the definition of stormwater associated with industrial activity, this program may affect you or does affect you. All right, so in terms of getting a permit, you can get coverage under our general permit for industrial stormwater that Ohio EPA issues, or there's also some facilities that get their coverage under an individual permit. Those are typically facilities that may have more than one type of discharge that requires an NPDES permit from their site. For example, they may also discharge processed wastewater in addition to the stormwater from their site, and therefore, if they've got multiple types of discharges, it might just be easier to have one permit that covers all the discharges rather than having a separate permit just for the stormwater runoff. Ohio EPA issues that general permit once every 5 years, just like any other NPDES permit. You know, it'll be issued in effect for 5 years and then get renewed. And terms and conditions within those permits can change from permit term to permit term. We are currently in the 7th generation of our industrial stormwater general permit, which is also known as the multi-sector general permit, or MSGP. If you hear me use that acronym throughout this presentation, I'm just referring to our general permit. The majority of our facilities are permitted under this general permit. And on the slide, you can kind of see some changes that have occurred to that permit over the last couple of permit terms. We'll talk about some of the significant ones that are currently in place later in the presentation. Like any other general permit that Ohio EPA issues, there are eligibility requirements. So it's possible that your facility is not eligible for coverage under the general permit. If that is the case, then your option would be to obtain the industrial permit, or that's how you would have to obtain your coverage, is through having an individual NPDES permit. So on the screen here, you see some of the situations that make you ineligible for coverage under the general permit that would require you to get an individual permit instead. There's also a general permit that covers the stormwater runoff from bulk petroleum stations and terminals. It has its own separate general permit for those types of facilities, and stormwater is included within there. If you have an individual permit, look to see if your permit has parts 4, 5, and 6. If it has parts 4, 5, and 6, that means your individual permit covers your stormwater discharge. Okay, so in terms of looking at that definition of stormwater associated with industrial activity, if you read through that, you'll notice that by and large, that's a list of what we call standard industrial classification codes, or SIC codes. And in the regulations, typically it's just the first 2 digits of the code, which they call the major group in the SIC manual. So if the regulation says, you know, this includes major group 24, like our slide shows an example of, that would really include all the parts and pieces within 24, all the 4-digit codes within 24, unless there are some exceptions specifically stated within that definition. So for the example on the screen, 24 is the major group for lumber and wood products, but if you're a sawmill, your specific 4-digit code is 2421. That's specific to sawmills and planing mills. The manual for the SIC codes is available online through the OSHA website, and you can go in and read the more specific definitions of every code within there. Now, within the MSGP, we translate those codes, those SIC codes, into what we call sector and subsector codes. And we do that using a table that you can find in Appendix D of the MSGP. And that's important to know what special conditions apply to your specific facility because of that specific activity that you do. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. All right, some industrial facilities may be described by more than one regulated code. If that is the case, then it's expected that your plan will address the requirements of all those codes. So there are some facilities that maybe have a couple different sectors and sector-specific requirements that would apply to them. But by and large, most facilities fall within a single sector. Most industrial facilities have moved towards using what's called the NAICS code. That's a North American Industrial Classification System code. Unfortunately, the stormwater regulations have not been amended to really reflect that. But if you don't know your SIC code, but you do know your NAICS code, there are lots of websites available for you to translate one from the other. And there's a link there to one of them. Some of the facility or some of the definition of stormwater associated with industrial activity describes facilities in narrative form. Those would include the ones that you see on the screen. If your facility is described in narrative form, then you're regulated, whether or not that's your primary activity. With the SIC code defined facilities, if your primary activity has to be regulated in order for you to require a permit. If it's just a secondary activity and not the primary activity, you wouldn't necessarily need a permit. But with the narratives, it's different. With the narratives, if you're described, you have to have a permit. Now, what is a primary activity? A primary activity is really based on revenue stream or number of employees engaged in that particular activity at your facility. So it's the majority of what you do at your facility. All right, so if you need a permit if you need coverage under the general permit, I should say, if you're a brand new facility, you're supposed to develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan or a SWIP plan, and then submit what's called a notice of intent or NOI for coverage under our multi-sector general permit. It's supposed to occur within at least 180 days prior to when you intend to initiate your operations at the facility. For those of you who are existing facilities and have permit coverage, every 5 years you'll get a notice to renew, and that renewal typically requires you to submit a new notice of intent and then revise your plan within a certain amount of time. So a renewal notice of intent is typically due within 90 days of the date that you're notified. And then the stormwater plan has to be amended within 180 days of your effective date of permit coverage. Like any other NPDES permit application these days, it's all done electronically through Ohio EPA's e-Business Center. So we have lots of guidance materials that are available to you on our website for how to complete a notice of intent, step-by-step guides with screenshots, how to set up your account in e-business as well. All right, so before I get into what's required by our multi-sector general stormwater permit, I want to kind of talk about an incentive program that's built into these regulations called the no exposure exclusion. So when these regulations were developed, they wanted to provide an incentive to facilities who could relatively easily move their industrial materials or activities indoors or protect them with what's termed a storm-resistant shelter. And if they could do that so that all of their industrial materials and industrial activities were within a storm-resistant shelter, then instead of getting a permit, they could submit what's called a no exposure certification or NOE to Ohio EPA. And they wouldn't have a permit, but they'd have to make sure they maintained the practices that qualify them for no exposure. Now, it is a conditional exclusion, so if Ohio EPA inspectors show up and see that your facility is not meeting the requirements at the time of inspection, you'll probably get a notice of violation, but you'll be given an opportunity to either bring your facility back into a condition so that it qualifies for the no exposure, or if just by the nature of your operations, it really isn't feasible for you to meet the requirements, we'll probably instruct you at that point, you need to get a permit. All right, so what is the definition of no exposure? It basically says that all industrial materials and activities are protected by a storm-resistant shelter to prevent the exposure to rain, snow, snowmelt, and or runoff. So you have to think about where things are placed on your site. You want to make sure that water can't start at an upper end of your facility, roll under your covered area, pick up pollutants, and roll back off and enter storm drainage systems. So it's important that you kind of know the lay of your land. If you do meet the requirements, you do have to submit that no exposure certification. There is a step-by-step guide to it on our website, and it's required that you recertify or resubmit that form essentially once every 5 years, just as if you had a permit, but it has to be renewed once every 5 years. If for some reason your facility conditions change in the middle of that term, let's say you submitted an NOE 2 years ago, but now you expanded your facility and you added some loading unloading area out that's exposed outdoors, you would be required to obtain the MSGP prior to starting operations where you're loading and unloading at the facility. So your no exposure kind of goes away once your MSGP comes into play. There is a guidance manual available and some language in Ohio Administrative Code that you can review to determine whether or not your facility meets no exposure. But just quickly, I'll kind of go through some examples. One common thing that might pull you into the program is having a waste dumpster exposed outside. Clearly, all waste dumpsters are mostly outside. The garbage truck has to come and pick them up, and they can come at odd hours of the day, so clearly they're not usually inside. But you have to make sure that if they are outside, that they have like an attached lid or they're under a roof, like you see in the picture on your left and the picture in your middle, are in good condition, don't have open drain plugs, and nothing is spilled in the process of transferring materials. So, that can be outside and not disqualify you from the no exposure exclusion. But if you look at the example in the picture on our right, that's just an open top roll-off container and uncovered. So clearly that's going to be exposed. You would not qualify for the no exposure exclusion if you had that at your facility. Now, here's an interesting example to kind of ponder, and you might want to think about what I'd mentioned just a few slides ago. But we have this storage shed out in the middle of a parking lot where different drums and containers of chemicals are stored, as you can see from the photos. It may not be evident from the photo, but in general, the flow of runoff on this site would go from like the back of the parking lot towards the storm drain that you see in the foreground of the picture on the left-hand side of the screen. If you're going to want to assess your shelter to see if it's really truly storm resistant, remember what I said, it has to be protected from rain, snow, snow melt, or runoff, right? So when we look at that shelter, it's just really a fence with some slats through the fence. If you look at the bottom of the shelter, which is depicted in the upper right-hand corner photo, you can see that there's nothing that really prevents the runoff from the parking lot flowing under the roofed sheltered area and then flowing to the catch basin. So is that a storm resistant shelter? The answer would be no. But you could make it one if you put like an asphalt berm around those upper sides so that the runoff bypassed and went around the roofed area of the shelter. And then for sure, it's not going to come into contact with the pollutant. So it's all in how you set things up. Here's just some more examples of storm resistant shelters, but notice that they are structural attached roofs essentially, or awnings, metal awnings over the area where the industrial materials or activities are conducted. In that no exposure guide, it goes into more detail about what can be exposed and not really disqualify you from the no exposure exclusion. For containers, tanks, drums, barrels, basically they have to be sealed. There can be no operational taps or valves. They have to be in good condition so nothing's leaking from them. And you cannot transfer material to or from the container while it is in an area that's exposed to stormwater. So if you got a tote outside, that's got a cap and it's sealed, you'd have to bring it inside the building to open the cap and add more material to it, and then you could take it back outside. So there's some conditions there, and you can see some of the other situations that also need to be thought about. All right, people ask us oftentimes about tarps. Well, I've got my waste dumpster and I put a tarp over it. Why can't I qualify for no exposure? Well, Ohio EPA's take on that is a tarp is a temporary type of cover. They're prone to needing more maintenance. They tear, wind can blow them. It's very easy for people to forget to reattach them after each and every use. And so we don't accept that really as a practice for no exposure. However, if you have a permit and you have a waste dumpster outside, tarping it is an excellent best management practice to minimize the exposure of those materials to the stormwater. So it's just all in how we look at that. All right. There's an exception if you're doing remodeling inside your facility and you need a construction and demolition debris temporary dumpster outside, for that temporary time period that you're doing the remodeling for that debris material. That can be at your facility outside, and it would not disqualify you from the no exposure exclusion because it's just a temporary thing that shouldn't be there for very long. All right. We also don't require, you also can store materials that are intended for outdoor use without just getting disqualified for the no exposure exclusion. However, there's a limit on that. It can't be things like salt or other materials that would be erodible or dissolvable. Just some more examples to kind of show you here of what might be exposed and what might not be exposed, or what you might have to think about a little bit closer. So do I need to submit a notice of intent or NOI or a no exposure certification, NOE? Well, just follow the friendly little flow chart here and hopefully that will give you your answer. Just to give you an idea of the roughly 4,000 plus facilities that Ohio has under our general permit program for industrial stormwater, about 2/3 of them have permits and about 1/3 of them have no exposure certifications. All right, it's time for our second poll question. Which of these are not considered to be a storm-resistant shelter? Sarah, you let me know when in the poll. Or did I do all that? Yep. All right, so the poll has been shared. So the winning answer was the correct answer, a tarped waste dumpster. Remember, that's a great BMP, but it won't get you out of needing a permit. All right, very good. Let's move on. So if you need a permit, what does the permit require of you? That'll be the rest of the presentation today. So the first and foremost requirement is that you develop and implement a stormwater pollution prevention plan. In the industrial general permit, it's abbreviated SWPPP, so that'll be the abbreviation that we use through here, but some of you may have seen that as SWP3. Honestly, they're interchangeable, but just to be consistent with the permit, you'll see SWPPP. So that SWPPP Is this letting? Yeah, there you go. All right. That SWPPP basically is a document which includes the information that you see on the screen. It's going to describe your facility. It's going to tell us what potential pollutant sources you have at your site. What are the control measures that you've implemented to try to minimize their discharge from your site or prevent their discharge from the site? What are your schedules and procedures for monitoring and inspection of control measures? And a certification of that plan that from one of the people of authority at your facility. The plan can be amended as things change, or maybe as you find a better control measure. Those amendments are supposed to be cataloged essentially in the appendix. So you'd have a log that kind of would identify the date you made the amendment and what you amended exactly. It may also include things such as, it is required to include things such as a site map, or it may have agreements that you might have for offsite transport of certain things. Those are all things that you might see in an appendix of a SWIP. So the facility information is basically exactly what you would imagine. Who you are, where you're located, what SIC code or codes you have, what subsector codes does that translate to, and who's the contact at the facility if there's a compliance issue. It does require that you put together that plan with and engage what's known as a pollution prevention team for your facility. It's important to keep in mind that this permit can affect a company of one person and a company of thousands of people. So sometimes that pollution prevention team is a team of one, and that's okay for a small business. But typically it's going to consist of a number of different department heads within an organization, or team leaders within an organization that oversee the manufacturing, processing, storage, handling, environmental stuff at the facility. It's important to make sure that your SWIP is updated with the current information, because when we come to do an inspection, we're going to ask for a copy of that plan. We're going to want to make sure that it's current. The facility description also includes a site map. And a site map basically kind of lays out your facility. Here's one that's somewhat simplistic, but part 5.1.2 of the permit, lists all the requirements that need to be shown, on the site map. So you do have to show where your pollutant sources are located, where your control measures are located, your drainage system from the site, which would include catch basins with the storm lines connected out to your outfall or outfalls. And outfalls, of course, are the locations where the runoff would actually discharge from your site to either a water of the state or to the municipal separate storm sewer system. It's also supposed to identify the acreage of your site. If you've got several outfalls which are substantially identical, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, it's supposed to identify which of the outfalls are substantially identical. So there's a number of requirements, and oftentimes when we do an inspection, we might find that the map isn't really as complete as it needs to be. All right, so in terms of the potential pollutant sources, you're going to basically just have a list of the materials that you handle or use at your facility. Those can be raw materials, intermediate products, byproducts, waste materials, anything that might at some point in its life at your facility become exposed to stormwater. Think about where you load or unload those materials. Think about how you convey and transport those materials across your site. What industrial machinery do you have outside and exposed to stormwater? Where do you have storage areas, the boneyard or your final products store or raw material storage area on your site? Those are all areas of industrial activity, and we would need control measures for those areas. Think about where leaks or spills are most likely to occur. Maybe you have a fuel station at your site, or maybe you've got a chemical silo outside, materials coming in and out of those containers. That's where a spill might occur. So, that's also another area where you'd want to focus. Maybe you store salt to make sure that sidewalks and parking lots are clean in the winter. and safe to walk on or in the winter. Where do you store that salt? If you've done any past monitoring, you're supposed to summarize what the past data has shown. So some potential typical sources that we see, you can see storage tanks, stockpiles, dumpsters, loading docks or rail lines, dust collectors, your air pollution control equipment essentially, scrap yards or bins, areas where you have bare soils typically. Maybe it's an area that's just not paved, or maybe it's where you're doing some construction work of sorts. So that could be part of it. Or some sites like a landfill is always going to have an area of disturbance, where there's bare soils. And then any outdoor areas where you might manufacture or process materials. All right. One of the things that you're required to also do in development of your stormwater pollution prevention plan is to look for any non-stormwater discharges and make sure that your facility has the appropriate authorization for those non-stormwater discharges. So this is somewhat akin to doing dry weather screening in the municipal stormwater program. But essentially, an industrial facility should be looking at their outfalls during a period of dry weather. And if they see flow, then they need to figure out why. The permit includes a list of things that are allowed to discharge to the storm sewers that are not stormwater, but those are typically clean water sources, like maybe, uncontaminated groundwater, or, maybe you have a sprinkler system and that water is kind of, going beyond the grass and into the storm drain. So that kind of stuff, potable water sources, that kind of stuff is all okay. But if it's not that, but if you do see flow, you need to figure out, is it that or is it not that? Is it something else? And if it's not on that list, basically it's something that you have to either appropriately permit or cease discharging from your site. That's called the non-stormwater discharge evaluation. So here are some of the things that are authorized that can go down the storm sewers, but other ones that are not, have to be dealt with appropriately. So when we say cease discharge, people always assume that means stop. But then facilities think, I can never have that discharge. Well, not discharge, but there's probably a different way to handle it. So think about what typically we run into. Maybe we run into a floor drain inside a building that is actually connected to storm rather than sanitary. So you could reroute that line to the sanitary, because all interior drains should go to the sanitary if they're allowed to discharge at all. Or you can cap that floor drain off so that nothing gets in it. So there's different ways to handle that scenario. Or maybe you can install a holding tank and then have an arrangement with a wastewater treatment plant locally to kind of take that water and just dispose of it there. Or you may have authorization, through the wastewater treatment plant's pre-treatment program to discharge things directly to the sanitary sewer system. So those are all different ways that you can handle these non-stormwater discharges, but it is your duty when you're developing your SWIP to evaluate your facility for these possible non-stormwater discharges and ensure that they're appropriately authorized or ceased. So learn to be a non-stormwater discharge detective. So you might have to maybe pour some dye down a drain to see where a floor drain goes for sure. Or you may have to climb up on your roof and see how good is your air pollution control equipment really working. As you can see in the lower left-hand corner, probably not that well. Or do you have pipes sticking out of the building that are connected to the roof drains or to the storm sewer? What are those pipes? What's discharging from there? Oftentimes we find, some non-contact cooling water discharge that's not authorized going to our stormwater system. So that needs a separate NPDES permit to authorize. So be a stormwater detective. All right. In terms of control measures, there are certain control measures that are required for all. And if you look at the permit, there's about 10 or 11 different sections, but they kind of boil down to the bullet points that you see on the slide. So where you can, minimize the exposure of pollutants. Put a tarp on it, move it indoors, Get a storage, container of some sort, like a storage shed, stick it in there. Good housekeeping, keep things swept, clean, orderly, neat. Preventative maintenance, you've got equipment out there. Is it on a maintenance schedule? To make sure that you don't have unintended leaks or pipe bursts that might cause, oil spills and whatnot to get into storm sewers. Spill prevention and response. If a spill occurs, do you clean it up right away? Do you have the equipment that you need to clean it up right away? Are people trained on what needs to be done when a spill occurs? That's all part of spill prevention and response. Erosion and sediment control and runoff management, is basically, as it would sound. If you have unpaved areas of your facility, bare, areas that don't have vegetation on your facility, do you have control measures in place to prevent the sediment from getting into the storm sewer system? Or do you have maybe a stormwater management pond that's been designed to remove pollutants from the site? If you're a newer build facility, you should have what we call a post-construction best management practice, but older facilities may or may not have something like that. And then if you store salt or garbage outside, you have to make sure those are in containers that are covered. Some facilities have unpaved areas, and so in the dry heat of the summer, like now, you have lots of dust that gets generated. Well, should I maybe water those roads essentially in my facility to keep the dust down? Am I tracking stuff off my site at the entrance? What can I do to prevent that from happening in the first place? Maybe I need to redress my gravel drive with stone, or maybe I need to pave that area, or maybe I need to put up some barriers to make sure the trucks stay on the pavement and not go in the grass. But if offsite tracking occurs, do I have a sweeper available, or do I have a service I can call to sweep the street and get that cleaned up? Those are things you need to think about in developing control measures. And of course, employee training. We do require that employees be trained at least once a year on the SWIP and its control measures, so that it's more likely that things actually get implemented at your facility. All right, just to kind of speed up our presentation here, because I know we're kind of starting to run a little bit shorter on time. In terms of how do I select my best management practices, the good news is that there are lots of guidance out there. US EPA has a series of fact sheets broken down by the type of industry you are, essentially by your sector code. That kind of goes into, at this type of facility, these are the typical sources of stormwater pollution. And here are some suggested best management practices and control measures that you can implement to address those sources. So it's kind of already kind of laid out for you. It's not an end all to be all list. And there was an effort a few years ago to try to update those lists that I don't think really resulted in an updated list yet, but that might be forthcoming still. But just be aware that there is help out there for you. So in addition to those fact sheets, US EPA has a guidance manual on how to develop your SWIP and things to think about. There's also a separate manual for monitoring if that applies to your facility. So there's lots of available help. However, I always tell people, use common sense. Is it outside? Can it get rained on? Can the runoff flow off your site, either directly into a catch basin, a drainage channel, and enter either a municipal storm sewer system or a water of the state? If the answer is yes, put something to prevent that. So curbing, diking, tarping, relocating things inside, implementing good housekeeping practices and being vigilant about spill response, employing sediment and erosion controls like inlet protection on your catch basins. That goes a long way and will address a majority of the issues at your site. So what you really shouldn't be seeing at your site is really what's depicted here in the photos. If you've got like etched concrete from what appears to be a drip from your waste dumpster, there's probably something in your waste dumpster that shouldn't be there. If you look down your catch basins, like the photo on the lower left-hand corner, and see a white liquid inside the catch basin outside your facility, something's probably cross-connected, or maybe somebody washed something into that catch basin that they shouldn't have, right? Or, you look at your dust collector and you see spillage all around the dust collector. Obviously, that shouldn't be how it is, right? So, it's making sure that, your container is properly fitted, that if spills occur, they get swept up immediately, all that kind of stuff comes into play. So you shouldn't see that. Rather, you should see more of what you see here. So if you have a fueling area, you've got a roof over it. If you've got containers, with liquids in them, they're in secondary containment. If you've got an area where it's always disturbed, you've got inlet protection on the catch basins, your waste dumpsters have lids, or your trash compactor has, you can load it from inside the building. It's not, there's no exposure there when you're loading it. Or you're storing things under the awning or in a building. So here's just an example we can look at, a fueling station. What's the issue? Obviously, we see lots of fuel spills, and it looks like maybe, there's some issues with the pump itself. Maybe it needs maintenance, and we see trash and debris. So what are some possible solutions? Well, you could install an automatic shutoff valve. You could establish procedures so that the driver remains at the fueling point the whole time that fuel is being, put in the vehicle. You can make sure that there's a spill kit nearby that contains, oil absorbent, that you can use. You could go the extra mile and put roofs or curb or grate or pave that area in a manner such that any stormwater that might fall in that area would not get into your storm drainage system. You could make sure that you do the preventative maintenance on the pump to make sure that those mechanisms don't fail. And should, for the trash and debris, good housekeeping, provide a trash can, something simple as that. So those are all possible solutions to this particular stormwater pollution source. So that's what you kind of need to do as you walk around your facility in identifying your sources and what control measures you'll be implementing. One area that we get pushback on a lot is scrap metal dumpsters. Okay, so we understand, you have a contract, somebody brings you the dumpster and they don't necessarily bring you one with a lid or cover, but just be aware, here's an example of one where it's open topped and it has a drain plug and the drain plug is open. And then, during the inspection, we're observing sheen in the runoff from the site. So clearly, there's an issue there. The drain should be plugged and the bin should be tarped or lidded, like you see here in this photo. And here's just an example with, metal. So this is from an actual inspection with an actual facility. They used to store their metal on racks outdoors, but didn't take any precautions to cover that area because they also then cut the metal outdoors. So there was some processing as well that occurred. Well, they were subject to doing some monitoring under the permit that we'll talk about in a bit, called benchmark monitoring. With that benchmark monitoring, they have to do a certain amount of time. They did it, and as you can see, the benchmark value for aluminum in this case is 750 micrograms per liter, but they were getting values that were, between 3,600 and 6,600. So, well above that benchmark. Then they said, okay, well, we're going to cover that. We're going to, kind of relocate our metals. We're going to cover those metals with a tarp. And it's still outside, we still kind of don't have room inside, so we're keeping it outside, but covering it with a tarp. And then they redid the benchmark monitoring to kind of see if that was effective or not. And as you can see, you had a 10-fold decrease in the aluminum concentration after they implemented that simple control measure of putting a tarp over the stored metal outside. And now they're below benchmark. So again, don't discount the simplicity of these controls. You think logically, use common sense. That'll take you a long way. All right, so when you look at the multi-sector general permit, parts 1 through 7 apply to all facilities regardless, but there's a part Part 8 that makes up the majority of the 160 pages or whatever it is, that really is broken down into a number of different sectors. And you only need to comply with those sections of Part 8 that apply to your facility. So again, you'd use your SIC code and Appendix D to translate that code into a sector and subsector code. And then you would only need to really make sure that your SWIP addresses the requirements that are applicable to to what's applicable to all, plus what's just applicable to your specific sector. And when you look at those, they're usually no more than a couple of pages within Section 8. So it's not really a lot of extensive extras, but there's going to be some extras and specific to your particular situation. But those sector-specific requirements in general can maybe limit the coverage or specify prohibited discharges from your facility. Like, for example, maybe if you're a mulch maker, you dye the mulch, it's going to prohibit the discharge of dyes from your facility. It might include more specific control measures, like, for example, if you're an auto junkyard, you're supposed to drain the fluids from the vehicles when they arrive. That kind of stuff is within the sector specific requirements. It may also have some additional requirements for your SWIP plan, or may increase inspection requirements too. And it will also identify if you have any monitoring required. So not all facilities, but about 60% of the facilities with a permit are required to do some form of stormwater monitoring under this permit. And that if you are subject to that, that will show up under Part 8 of the permit, under your particular sector, and then you will look for your specific subsector to determine whether or not you have those requirements. So let's talk about the inspection and monitoring requirements of the MSGP. There's two types of inspections. Those are applicable to all facilities. The two types of inspections are routine facility inspections and quarterly visual assessments. I'll describe what they mean in a minute. Then there's three types of potential monitoring, meaning collect your stormwater sample, send it off to the lab, and report your results to Ohio EPA. Those three types of analytical monitoring that might apply to your facility, like I said, about 60% of the facilities, is benchmark monitoring, effluent limitation monitoring, or as requested by Ohio EPA. So I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in the slides to come as well. But by and large, most facilities, it would be the benchmark monitoring. All right, let's go back to the inspections. The routine facility inspection, it is applicable to all permittees. You are required to do basically a walkthrough of your facility once a quarter and check out your control measures. Make sure that they're in place, that they're effective. If they need maintenance, that you do the maintenance then. Or if they're ineffective, you select something else and move on. Amend your SWIP and move on. So those are required every single quarter. However, there are certain sectors, sector D, E, and J. So this would include things like mining, ready-mix concrete facilities. If you fall within any of those sectors, if you're inactive and unstaffed for an entire quarter of the calendar year, so our monitoring periods essentially are January 1st to March 31st, April 1st to June 30th, July 1st to September 30th, and October 1st to December 31st. So if you are inactive and unstaffed for that entirety of that time period, then you can get away and not have to do the routine facility inspections for that quarter or those quarters. But for everybody else, basically, you have to do them every single quarter. Certain sectors, based on conditions in Part 8 for your sector, do increase that to a monthly inspection. So be aware of that might be the case for your facility. They have to be performed while the facility is in operation with a member of the pollution prevention team, and at least once during the year. So one of those 4 per year have to be done when runoff is actually discharging from your site. So typically when it's raining or shortly after it stopped raining, right? All right, and then you are required to document your findings and maintain your inspection results on site with your stormwater pollution prevention plan. They have to be made available to Ohio EPA or the operator of the municipal separate storm sewer system upon request. The second kind of inspection is the quarterly visual assessment. Some people think of this as monitoring, but it's really not monitoring. They think of it as monitoring primarily because you are actually going out and collecting a sample of your runoff. You're actually required to go out and grab a sample of the runoff from each point of discharge within the first 30 minutes of discharge from the first storm after a dry period of at least 72 hours prior, and observe what's in your collection jar. So you're looking for the physical things or the olfactory things that you can sense, that might indicate pollutants are in your runoff. So it's things like color, odor, clarity. Is anything floating? Anything settling? Anything suspended within the water in the container? If I close the lid and I shake it up, am I getting foaming? You're looking for those obvious indicators of pollution. If you see that, then you're supposed to go back through your facility to figure out what the source might be, make sure your BMPs are in good stead, and if not, fix them, maintain them, replace them, repair them, etc., and then see how you do the next quarter, right? So again, you'd have to document those findings in a report that stays on site with your stormwater pollution prevention plan, and make that available to Ohio EPA or the operator of the municipal separate storm sewer system upon request. Now, I mentioned the term substantially identical outfalls a while ago. Well, we do know that some facilities have more than one outfall, more than one point where the stormwater leaves the site, and maybe they've got 10. So how am I going to get to 10 different places in the first 30 minutes of discharge? I'm only one person. Yeah, it might be difficult, right? So there's a provision in the permit that says, well, you don't have to do them all necessarily, but you may have a group where the same activities are occurring, the same materials are exposed, you have approximately the same, drainage areas, and, there's a lot of similarities between what occurs here. Within that specific sub-drainage watershed, to that particular outfall. If that's the case, then you can call those substantially identical outfalls, and you only have to do one of that set of substantially identical outfalls each quarter. But the permit does require you to go to a different one each quarter and to basically rotate through all that set, that entire set, from quarter to quarter to quarter. Analytical monitoring, if you are subject to it, regardless of the type of analytical monitoring, the same sampling requirements apply as what applies to the visual assessment. You have to collect that sample, it's a grab sample, within the first 30 minutes of discharge, and from a storm event that produces runoff from your site. That's the first rain that's occurred in the last 72 hours. So you have to have that the antecedent dry period of 72 hours or more. That's the storm you want to sample. If you are subject to analytical monitoring, the results have to be reported to Ohio EPA. So you use what we call our EDMR system, or electronic data monitoring report system, through our e-business center to report those results. You are required to report those results within 30 days of receiving the results from the lab. Now, for the current permit term that we're in, it started back in 2022, right? So June 1st, 2022. So I'm going to talk about the schedule for benchmark monitoring here shortly, but for the facilities that are currently under permit, if you were subject to benchmark monitoring requirements, your deadline to complete that monitoring for this permit term is over. So have you recently received a notice of violation for not submitting your data? Here's a link to some instructions for how to submit your data. All right. So, I talked about benchmark monitoring. It's going to be based on your subsector code, really specifically. You'll look in Part 8, you look at the table that talks about benchmark monitoring. If your subsector code is listed, then you have to do the monitoring that's specified in that table for that subsector code. The other two types of monitoring I'm going to cover extremely briefly because they don't apply to very many facilities, but certain facilities, there's a table 6-1 in the permit, in part 6 of the permit, that discusses the 5 or 6 different scenarios that if you have runoff from this specific thing, then you would have to do this additional monitoring. that monitoring is strict effluent limit monitoring. So if you do the monitoring and you're over that limit, that's a violation of your permit. You have to immediately, implement control measure, check your control measures, implement something better, or fix whatever failed, and then redo that monitoring and then resubmit those results to see if you fixed it or not. But you have to basically fix it for sure. And then the other type of monitoring that we'll spend very little time on is you may get a written notice from Ohio EPA, or we may issue you coverage under Sector AD, which is a catch-all sector, to kind of catch things that aren't in the other things. That we might want to assign monitoring to you for, because we've had some past history with you, or there's been an incident, and we need to kind of keep our eyes on the runoff from your site. All right, in terms of benchmark monitoring, just to go into that a little bit more, since it is what's most applicable to most facilities, you are required to do the monitoring for your primary industrial activity and any co-located activities. So that means basically your primary SIC code and any secondary or tertiary SIC codes that apply to your facility. So a lot of times those secondary codes keep you within the same sector, but it might put you in a different subsector. So there might be a little bit different monitoring that applies. But other times it may put you in a completely different sector. So you've got two completely different sets of parameters to monitor for. But the important thing to keep in mind is that if that sector is only going to that outfall, then really that's the only outfall that you have to apply that other monitoring to. So it really is broken down, by the drainage area going to that outfall in terms of that. All right, so you are required to take at least 4 samples over the first 8 quarters of permit coverage. So each time that you renew your permit, this starts over again. Some facilities think that they did it once the first time it was in their permit and they don't have to do it again. That's not true. Every time that permit is renewed, this is your schedule. So you have to redo it. So in this current permit, we actually changed the schedule. It used to be that you had to do 4 samples in 12 quarters. We've reduced that down to 4 samples in 8 quarters. And it's the first 8 quarters of coverage. So 1 sample has to come from each quarter of the calendar year. So that means you have 2 chances to grab a winter quarter sample, 2 chances to grab a summer quarter sample, and so on. But you got to do at least one of those 2 and report that data to us over that first 2-year time period. The other thing that was added to the permit is that you do that monitoring and you get your results. You average your results. And if your average exceeds the benchmark concentration for that parameter, you now have to redo the benchmark monitoring over the next 8 quarters of time. So, that example I gave you of with the metals, they would have been required to redo the sampling, and they would have to do at least 4 more quarters over the next 8, to see if that fixed it or not. We talked about substantially identical outfalls as it pertains to quarterly visual assessments. For benchmark monitoring, you can also reduce your monitoring burden if you have a group of outfalls that are substantially identical. You only have to do the benchmark monitoring at one of those outfalls. But the difference with benchmark monitoring versus quarterly visual assessment is you don't have to rotate through that set. We want you to pick one, probably the one that's most representative of that set, and keep monitoring that same one throughout the entirety of this permit. So you're not rotating. That's the difference here. All right, like any other good, okay, we're ready for our next poll question. Very good. Actually, we're gonna have a couple of poll questions. The first one, all facilities are required to conduct routine facility inspections, quarterly visual assessments, and benchmark monitoring every quarter. Is that true or false? Okay, Sarah, end of the poll. Well, again, the winning question was the right answer. It is false. So it is true for routine facility inspections and quarterly visual assessments, but not benchmark monitoring, because it's not every quarter, it's that 4 quarters over the first 8. And then if you're over the benchmark, redo it. All right. There's another poll question, I believe. All right. When should you collect your stormwater sample for quarterly visual assessments and benchmark monitoring? When you arrive at the facility the morning after it rains at least 1/10 of an inch, within the first 30 minutes of discharge from a measurable storm event, even if it's still raining and it's safe to do so, once it stops raining, or prior to the 15th of the month. Okay, I think you can probably stop the poll. All right, so again, the winning question was the right answer. So when we do these inspections and we ask, when did you collect your samples? Often people say, it was when I came in the next morning. It's like, well, if the rain event wasn't until 2 o'clock in the morning and you're not normally staffed at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's probably not the storm event that you should be sampling. You have to just plan for the next one, right? So there's that, but it's very important that you follow the protocols, because we want to that runoff that is coming off that site initially is probably the worst case scenario, the most polluted runoff. So that's why it's kind of set up. We want you to capture that first flush, see how bad that really is. All right, very good. We can move on then with our presentation and wrap it up. I have to close that, Sarah. Okay, all right, let's wrap. Oops, I think I went too far. There we go. All right, like any other good permit that you get from EPA, it does require that you document everything and keep records, right? So the good news is that on our website, we've got a template for the stormwater pollution prevention plan, and we've also got templates for all the records that you need to keep under this permit. These are US EPA developed forms. They should all be good to use as is. I would really encourage you just to use these forms. The inspectors are used to seeing these forms. It's a lot easier for them to pick out what they need to see, with something that they're familiar with. Something to keep in mind too is that a lot of facilities will have other environmental permits, other requirements in place, and they'll tell us, well, we inspect it daily or we inspect it monthly, and here's our form. If it's not the stormwater form, and it's probably not really targeting the stormwater control measures, and so it's not really documenting properly, we will probably take issue with that. So do get in the habit of adopting these forms and using these forms as much as you possibly can. All right, there's also an annual report that has to be completed. So you want to look in Appendix I of the general permit. That's where you will find a link essentially to take you to the annual report. It has to be completed each year of your NPDES permit term. It's just supposed to, you're supposed to just do it at a consistent date, so within your stormwater pollution prevention plan, you can say, we will complete this in the month of January each year, or will it be done by, January 1st of the year, whatever you want to say. But essentially, there is a report that kind of summarizes essentially your activities over the past year. What were your findings from your various inspections and monitoring? What did you change as a result of that? What have you now improved? Right, that report has to remain on site with your stormwater pollution prevention plan. So be aware of that. We can ask for it. The operator of the municipal separate storm sewer system can ask for it. So be prepared to produce it when requested. And then the final piece of documentation I wanted to kind of highlight, and it is something that's now actually part of it's within the annual report. So you can basically just keep adding this information to your annual report, to that part of the report that discusses this topic. But let's say you do a routine facility inspection and you found that the inlet protection got damaged and now, something leaked into the storm sewer as a result of that. Well, you're supposed to document the problem within 24 hours of discovery. So you're going to want to basically describe what the problem was that you found and the date that you identified that problem. And then within 30 days of that discovery, you're supposed to summarize the corrective actions taken, or if it's something that requires, a bigger expenditure and maybe approvals that take some time, what is your plan? What is the corrective action that you're going to take? And the schedule by which you're going to do it. Now, if it's something that's really high priority, and we would expect you to probably take interim measures to, temporary measures to cease the discharge as immediately as you possibly can, if it's going to take some time to put the permanent fix into play. So be aware of that. Right, and then you may determine that everything was okay, that everything in the end did work like it was supposed to, but you still had this issue. There's really no further action you can take. We don't want you to default to that because that's usually not the case, but be aware there's some language in the permit that can let you conclude that legitimately. And then document the date that the corrective action was initiated, completed, or is expected to be completed, as we discussed. All right. There's lots of that online guidance. Here's some links to that guidance. I'm assuming that the presentation will be made available to the attendees, but you can click on those links and it'll take you right to the guidance documents that we've discussed, as well as some webinars that kind of step you through how to put together a plan and things to look for in more detail. And with that, I'll conclude our presentation. Here are all the stormwater program contacts within the state of Ohio and how you can get a hold of them. Be aware that unlike other programs, we've kind of stopped assigning counties. Okay, so in the stormwater program, in each office, we typically have someone who specializes in construction permitting or working, compliance, and one that specializes in industrial stormwater compliance. And MS4 auditing is kind of shared between the staffing at the office. Here in Northeast District Office, where I'm physically located, we actually have 3 inspectors, so we have one that covers each area, that specializes in each area. But in general, it's shared, the MS4 auditing. So it's a little bit different than it used to be, and so I wanted to make sure that I made you aware of that. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for having me today. Any questions?
Dan, this is Angela. Thanks again for a beautiful presentation. Lots of great information. We did have a couple questions in the chat. We're a little over time, but if you could quickly respond to thank you for doing presentation, informative. Is it common for Ohio EPA to deny industrial stormwater permit applications? For example, if the runoff is deemed excessive, what factors or metrics determine approval?
So we don't deny a stormwater permit. If you're required to have a permit, you'll get a permit, but it may be that you don't qualify for the general permit and you have to get an individual NPDES permit that will cover your stormwater discharge. So I think that might be the case sometimes, but I don't think we would ever deny the runoff, right? We have to, if it's a regulated site, they're allowed to discharge the runoff as long as it's in compliance with the permit.
Okay, great. And then another one, are there any trends in the volume of applications for industrial stormwater permits? Like, has the number of applications been increasing? Are permits for like mega projects such as the Ohio 1 chip plant handled differently?
I'd say more or less steady. I think that, I always tell a new inspector when they start, you can make a whole career of trying to find the facilities that are subject to this program and seeing if they have a permit or not. I know at one time we kind of took a look at a business index, And we found that really just by SIC code, there were probably about 20,000 facilities across the state of Ohio just by code that might be regulated. But clearly, you know, we don't have the resources to really track everybody down like that. So I'd say overall the numbers are steady as complaints come in, and we look, you know, we become aware of facilities. We certainly, if they need a permit, get them under permit. You know, once in a while we'll maybe be at a site and then we notice, hey, the site next door needs a permit too, but doesn't have one. So we might knock on the door and, you know, get the conversation going that way as well. You know, but it's really, you know, kind of somewhat limited by our resources to be able to totally track everybody down. But I'd say overall it's roughly steady.
Okay, great. I have one more, but before I ask that question, someone has requested you put the contact information slide back up. Would you share?
Sure.
Go to that slide.
I think you have to stop sharing what you're sharing, right? Or is that it?
I'm not sharing.
Can you see it?
No.
No, I didn't do anything to unshare. Let's see here. Zoom. I don't, oh, here's the share button. Okay. Screen, share.
Yeah.
And if I say concurrent.
There.
There we go. There we go.
There. Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, and then the last question, if a TARP is considered temporary, as we discussed it earlier in the presentation, but then later there were some slides that had a TARP. How long does the agency consider it too long to manage exposure with a TARP?
So the point of the TARP was if you have a waste dumpster and it's just tarped, it's not going to, your facility is not going to qualify for the no exposure exclusion.
Ah.
Yeah. But if you have a waste dumpster and it has a tarp on it and you have a permit, that's good because it's a BMP, right? So as long as the tarp is in good condition and you remember to, you know, put it back in place and so forth, it's a BMP. You know, we'll be happy with that tarp if you have a permit, but it's not going to get you out of having a permit. That's the key lesson.
Okay, great. And then we just had one question that's more administrative. Will these slides be available later? For WAMO and Ohio Stormwater Association members, the recording of this presentation is available. And I know, Dan, you provided a lot of links in the slides. We'll figure out a way to send, if not all the slides, then at least some of the links or all the links that we can to those who attended today. But the slides themselves and the recording of this presentation is available on WAMO's website for WAMO members. And it's a good deal to become a WAMO Stormwater member because then you can have access to all the previous webinars, and Ohio Stormwater Association webinars are free of charge normally to members. So this was a little bit special one because of the scholarship benefit, and that is why why you could have been attending today at no charge. I wonder if Lashana is still on the call. She was going to close out the meeting today.
Yes, I am still here. I am working to share my slides with everyone. Let's see. Okay. All right. Is everyone able to see the slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay. All right. I'm just getting feedback. All right. So we want to. I'm not sure what's going on. We want to thank our partners. And our partner highlight for today is Advanced Drainage System. We want to thank ADS for its commitment to our water resources. We'd also like to thank our affiliates as well for offering discounts on training to our members, as well as MAPS. And our sponsors for this year's X-Golf networking event, which will take place Thursday, October 9th. And we are having this event in several locations: Toledo, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland. We hope to see you there. Other ways to get involved with our organization, you can volunteer to be a part of one of our committees. You do not need to be a member to be a part of one of our committees. And again, just some upcoming events. So we have our next webinar, October 1st, 2025. As I mentioned before, our X-Golf event. And the WAMO annual meeting and symposium is coming in November. Thank you, Dan, for that wonderful presentation. It was very informative. Myself, Lashana Weeks, I'm with the City of Toledo. I am your moderator for today, and Sarah Saylor with WAMO for running all of the background poll questions and hosting the platform for us today. And again, this webinar is done with WAMO for its annual scholarship fund. If you have any questions about that scholarship fund, feel free to reach out to Sarah. And there's also a QR code here if you would like to support the scholarship fund. And again, thanks for those who have already contributed today. All right. Thanks, everyone.